super, super important, right? So we're going to look at fluid and electrolyte requirements for exercise, some of the problems, and the next chapter is looking at environmental issues, and fluid and dehydration also feed into that chapter as well. Altitude increases our risk of getting dehydrated, so we have a extra additional problem when we're living here. So remember objectives matching back to the ones at the beginning of the chapter in chapter 9, in case I've removed something you don't need to spend too much time on. Okay. Some overview of the problems with fluids. 2%, even for some people even less than 2%. Dehydration, so loss of body weight through fluid loss, leads to a decrease in performance in certain events, right? And memory, attention, focus, all are affected by 2% fluid loss. Right? So just being dehydrated and coming to class could affect your ability to learn and absorb material that's important. All right? So even for class, being fully hydrated is really crucial. When you're dehydrated, your heart rate goes up, body temperature goes up, and both of those things cause additional stresses through other mechanisms. And it doesn't take very much, only between 9 to 12% of your body weight lost in fluid can be fatal. So it's a really small margin between being healthy and being quite ill or worse. Okay? So we've got to pay attention. Water is about somewhere around 60% of our body weight. Okay? And lean muscle tissue holds about 75% of lean muscle tissue is water. Only about 25% of body fat is water. So when we look at bioelectrical impedance as a measure of body fat percentage, there can be some issues there, because muscle moves the current faster, and they don't have very good, not all the bioelectrical impedance scales have a way of telling the computer that you're an athlete or that you have a large muscle mass, and so they overestimate body fat percentage. Right? The one that we used in class, the handheld one, had a specific setting to be an athlete. So they're getting better at that idea, but more traditional bioimpedance scales and gadgets can really affect, can really mess up the estimation of your body fat percentage, particularly if you're dehydrated when you take the measure. All right, so you've got to pay attention to being hydrated when you're using that particular form of measurement. So water is our 6th nutrient group, and people often forget to think of water as a nutrient because it doesn't have any calories and it doesn't give us food, right? But as we've already seen, it's critical to survival. Okay? So we get water in, we ingest fluids in liquid form. Certain food groups have much higher percentage of water than others. And we also generate water when we're working aerobically. Okay? Remember, at the end of our electron transfer, we've got hydrogens and oxygen combining to make water. So we make water as well. we lose somewhere around 2.5 litres a day. It's an average figure. Obviously, the bigger you are, the more surface area you've got, the more water you lose versus someone who's small. So 2.5 litres is an average. Okay. And size also factors in with physical activity and the environment that you're working or living in. Okay. So, but at rest, the body is pretty good when we're not doing very much at keeping this water balance even. Right? But when we exercise, the challenges become quite severe. So, bless you.
Thank you.
So about 60% of our intake usually is in liquid form, 30% comes through food, and somewhere around 10% we make for ourselves, right? And somehow we have to balance the water intake with water loss. The technical term for being fully hydrated is euhydration. If I've got an overall net loss, so if I'm not taking in enough to match my water loss, hypohydration. And it doesn't take very long for hypohydration to be dehydration. All right? Water in the body, right? Obviously part of the blood and makes up most of the blood plasma, allows us to transport proteins, glucose, vitamins, minerals around our body. If we didn't have water, we wouldn't be able to move those nutrients around. Plays a major role in helping us maintain body temperature by cooling us down, right? It's the main component of sweat, and it also, through the bloodstream, moves heat from the core out to the periphery so that we can lose heat through the skin. So not having enough water can impact body temperature quite quickly. Lubricates joints, lubricates our eyes, right? Our eye fluid is predominantly water, so one thing to look for is if you wake up in the morning, and sometimes you wake up and you open your eye and your eyes feel like you've got shards of glass in them, they're really scratchy. That's an indication of being dehydrated, right? So try to make sure that you drink enough water before you go to bed, that you're waking up and your eyes feel smooth, right, when you blink and not scratchy. So what form does it come in and do we lose it? All right, we've got to look at this balance, a bit like our energy balance, our seesaw with our food intake and our physical activity. Similar idea about trying to maintain the balance as level as we can. All right, so here's our water in, liquids, food, metabolic. All right, if we look at those percentages, 60, 30, 10, in respect to milliliters, then for this individual, right, 1,400 to 2,800 milliliters a day. So I have to match that to water loss. So where am I losing? How do I know this is enough? Right? So we lose through urine, that's the obvious one, right? Sweating, which will go up as we exercise. We lose a little bit when we pass feces, and insensible perspiration is quite high, and it's not one we think of very often. That's fluid that we lose through our respiratory tract. Right? So when you breathe out, that area is damp. Right? If you breathe onto a glass, you get little droplets of water. Okay? That's one form of water loss for the body. So this means that I need 0.5 to 1.5 liters a day, not to do anything. So on a day when you're relatively sedentary, you still need somewhere up to 1.5 litres of fluids, right? Not just fluids, but water, to maintain water balance on a rest day. Right? So do you need to drink 1.5 litres? No, because you're going to have food that has water in it, right? Vegetables, fruits, salads, potatoes, okay? But you still need to be drinking quite a lot, even at rest. When we exercise, that's going to change, okay? Because we want to try to maintain hydration, normal hydration, as much as possible when we exercise. So 1.5 litres will go up, particularly if we're working out in hot and or humid climates. Yes, sir?
You can drink too much water, correct?
You can. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's difficult. I would say it would be really difficult in this environment to drink too much, but it can happen. It's not the water that's the problem, it's the impact on the sodium balance in the body. So probably Friday we'll cover that information. You can. It's difficult, I think, as an athlete because you sweat so much. It would be hard to drink too much. All right, so when we exercise, one of the problems we hear about, one of the things that the sports drink manufacturers tell us is having to replace electrolytes. Okay? And electrolytes, things like sodium chloride, okay, dissolve in water, they dissociate to form ions, and their job is to keep the water in the tissues where it's needed. Right? They allow electrical charges to occur. So if I can't move the electrical impulse down the nervous tissue correctly or across the surface of the muscle correctly, then I've got problems with responding to signals and information. Okay? Nerves and muscle fibers are excitable tissues, remember, and they need that water even more, right, to transmit that electrical current. So, we need water in cells, we need water around cells to maintain normal tissue function. I don't want all the water shifting out of the body tissues and to the kidneys. So electrolytes kind of do the job of holding the water where it needs to be in the tissues. When we exercise, we lose electrolytes through sweat, particularly sodium chloride, right? Sweat is a bit salty. So the salt is the electrolytes we're losing when we're exercising. So in order to maintain that, right, if I want to stay fully hydrated, I need to maintain electrolytes in the body. Dysfunction occurs if we lose too many of them. So electrolyte drinks can be very beneficial in certain environments. Right? If I'm down in the max pack and the heating and cooling is working well, I probably don't need very much electrolyte drink, if any. Right? But if I'm outside and I'm sweating heaps and heaps and heaps, or I'm in a gym where the cooling isn't on, or they don't want to run the cooling because it's expensive. Right? They used to do that. Gym camp I used to work at, they would tell the parents that the cooling system was broken, but it wasn't broken. They just didn't want to run it because it's expensive and it cut into their profit. Right? So what's the environment like that you're training in? You know, if the gym is really, really hot and you're going to be sweating buckets, then an electrolyte supplement may be useful. You don't have to buy really expensive sports drinks. You can get little mix powders that contain potassium and sodium, and they're much cheaper than buying Gatorade, or you can just add salt, but it doesn't taste very good. So, let me see. So, the electrolyte balance is maintained really by the kidneys. They're responsible for trying to conserve sodium as much as possible. So the kidneys will reabsorb sodium if the content in your body is low. Okay. When we're sweating, sweat has a lower pressure than blood, and so it has less electrolytes, right? And how much sweat do you think you lose when you exercise, you guys? Probably for the girls, 2 to 3 liters. But think about that. Anybody got water? Okay. So let's see. That's half a liter. Okay? So if you're doing really, really high level intensity exercise, and or it's very hot, or both, then 8 of those in an hour. Now, probably not Cassie, she's female and small. Probably Colin, because he's male. I didn't say that. That's not nice. Oh my gosh.
You didn't have to say it, you implied it.
I didn't imply it. I'm talking body size, not that F word. Oh my goodness. All right. Geez, you guys are nice to each other. All right, so a large amount of sweat can be lost. If I'm sweating that much, then I'm losing a lot of electrolytes. All right, so I'm at risk of not paying attention, right, because only 2% needs to be lost in order to lose some memory function and some cognitive function. So if I'm losing 4 liters and I'm not paying attention to that, then I may not be focused on the movement pattern that I'm doing. So that's going to lead to injury, right? If I'm not paying attention, that's when we do silly things and we get hurt. Let alone the physiological impact on your actual performance. Okay? So we also lose water and electrolytes through the urine. But as I said, if the kidneys note that the sodium content is low, they will reabsorb sodium and you don't lose as much through your urine. Right? When we exercise then, the harder we work, the more sodium we're losing through sweat, the less sodium excretion we see in the urine. We also stop making quite as much urine. Right? So if you exercise for a long time, you might realize that, oh my God, I've been like training for 2.5 hours and I haven't had to go for a pee. And yet when I'm in class, I can't make it through 45 minutes of class without having to go for a pee. Right? Because when we exercise, we redivert blood flow away from the kidneys to the muscles, so the kidneys stop making so much urine. All right. Let's see. it doesn't work very well in humans. It's one of the few things that we don't do very well. We didn't evolve a very good thirst response. If you have a dog, how many of you have dogs? A few of you, right? If you have a dog and you take the dog out to the park and you throw the ball a bit on a hot day and you put down a bowl of water for the dog, how long does it take the dog to drink that water? About, you know, they put their face in and before you know it, the bowl's empty, right? They don't come up for air or anything. Right? Humans aren't very good at that. We're not very good at drinking when we need to drink. And the thirst mechanism is our safety mechanism for trying to stop us getting dehydrated. However, it doesn't work properly because in order to be thirsty, I have to be dehydrated. So thirst is just a descriptive word for your brain's signal to you that you need to drink something. All right? And there are areas in the hypothalamus in the brain that recognize when your blood plasma has dropped down a little bit. So as you're exercising and you're sweating, your blood plasma drops down because the water's being sweated out rather than moving around in the blood. And your brain picks that up and tells you you're thirsty. Okay. But that meant that in order to feel thirsty, you had to already be slightly dehydrated. So it's not a very effective way of, particularly for athletes, it's not an effective way of deciding when to drink because you're already dehydrated. And what you want when you're performing is to not get dehydrated in the first place. So that means that you have to enact quite a large amount of discipline and drink when you don't think you want to drink. Right? You can't wait until you're thirsty. You've got to have a drink before you're thirsty so you don't get thirsty. Okay. That's quite a lot of discipline because to make yourself drink some water when you don't feel thirsty is kind of, you know. Best way, I think, best way to do it, carry the water with you all the time. Every 15, 20 minutes, take a couple of glugs. Right? You don't have to drink half a bottle, you don't have to drink a bottle every 20 minutes. You've got to stay on top of it. Right? Have a little bit every 20 minutes or so. Right? Don't wait a whole hour before you have a glass of water, because then you're going to have to drink a lot in order to stay hydrated, and then it kind of sits in your stomach and you don't feel very comfortable. So if you keep drinking small amounts more regularly, then that will help you get to a point where you don't get thirsty. Having said that, in this environment, I can't not get, I mean, it doesn't matter how much I drink. Does anybody manage to get to a point where they're never thirsty? Within here? Anyone? I can't do it. Doesn't matter. Even when I'm really being strict, it's hard to drink enough water here. So, we dehydrate quite quickly. We don't have a very effective mechanism for staying hydrated from a balance point of view, right? Maintaining that hydration. Thirst works very well at rehydrating us if we've got dehydrated, right? You get to it, you have to have a drink. You absolutely have to have a glass of water. It doesn't matter what else is going on, right? So once it kicks in, it's very effective at making you drink to try to get you hydrated again. But as athletes, you don't want to get dehydrated in the first place. Okay. So we're pretty slow. It takes us a while. Certain people are worse than others, but it can take 48 hours for a human to rehydrate. if they allow themselves to get dehydrated quite badly and they only drink when they want to, right? So if you don't instill some discipline and make yourself drink, it can take you a long time to get back to being healthy, right? Get back to balance. So try to increase how much you drink. Keep it up over time rather than wait. You don't want that increase in heart rate, right? It's going to impact performance. Why do you think we see the increase in heart rate? Don't know? Okay, so blood plasma volume goes down if I'm dehydrated. I'm sweating the water out rather than maintaining it within my bloodstream to move oxygen and glucose around my body. So that means it becomes harder to transport oxygen and glucose, and so the heart has to work harder to transport the equivalent amount of oxygen. So heart rate goes up. So if you're dehydrated, even sitting here in class, your resting heart rate would be higher than it is normally. Right? You add exercise into that picture, and if you wear a heart rate monitor, you're going to see heart rates that are quite a bit higher than they are normally for that same piece of work. So it's a good indicator that you're dehydrated. Another reason why a heart rate monitor is a great idea. Right? Because if you're doing a piece of work that you normally do and your heart rate is usually around 97 when you do that piece of work, and all of a sudden your heart rate is 110, but you don't feel sick, you're not running a fever, you don't have a sore throat, you're not nauseous, right? Why the heck is your heart rate 110? There wouldn't be any reason for your heart rate to be 110. So it's an indicator that you're dehydrated. All right, so we go back here. Okay, so when I'm exercising then, I'm going to lose more water when I'm sweating. Sweating is the body's mechanism for trying to cool itself down. So when I exercise, I make more heat, right? We're breaking down energy source and food to make energy. That means I'm releasing heat. So the body's response is to ramp up the sweating mechanism to try to release as much heat as possible. Quite effective, usually. When we're looking at environmental challenges in the next chapter, we'll see some of the problems with altitude or humidity and the sweating mechanism. Because the humidity plays a big role. Here we sweat. Anyone ever, do you manage to sweat enough when you're working here outside to really get down? Because it's hard here, because the water evaporates so quickly. Anybody been to the south, Alabama? Anybody come from Alabama? Mississippi, Georgia? Georgia?
What about Houston?
Houston? Yeah, it's pretty humid in Houston, right? Really? So when you run or you bike in those environments, what's sweating like?
Sucks.
Sticky. Right? It's more than sticky. It literally runs down your legs, right? Runs down your arms. You don't cool off. Doesn't do its job. Okay. Environmental factors play a role in your susceptibility to dehydration. So you want to pay attention to this thirst mechanism idea. When it's windy, Remember our respiratory loss? Well, when it's windy and your brain switches your breathing pattern to your mouth, not your nose, because it wants more air. Okay, we talked about that weeks ago. Right? Well, now I'm losing more water. When it's windy, I lose more water. Plus, I lose water off my skin. Oh, good. Well, we got one brownie point then, because we're not windy here, right? So we don't have to worry about the wind. Okay. Altitude, temperature. We don't have humidity. So that's really the only environmental issue we don't have to worry about being in mortality. If you play cricket, if you play football, several of you, okay. Sports, outdoor sports where you're going to wear protective clothing increase your risk of dehydration. So you've got to be even more aware and careful about your fluid intake. Weight class sports, so sports where you have to weigh in to make a certain group, so jockeys, weightlifters, judo, players, I don't know, boxing, yes. Wrestling, all right, weight class sports tend to be at risk for dehydration. Because you weigh in first thing, and they say, okay, next weigh in 2 hours. And you stand on the scale and you're like, I don't want to be in that weight class, because I'm going to be at the bottom of that weight class. I want to be at the top of the weight class lower down. So you spend 2 hours running around the building in a rubber suit, or sitting in the sauna, or taking diuretics and trying to pee out as much water as you can, so that when you go back for the second weigh-in, you can go, oh yes, I lost 2 pounds, I can drop down a weight class. Very silly practices people get up to in weight class sports. But a lot of them involve some severe risk of dehydration, which is then not very good because you go to compete and you can't do your job as an athlete because you've dehydrated in order to make the weight class. So it's kind of self-negating, really. Dark coloured clothing. So when it's hot in particular and you're outside, nor me, I'm not a very good role model. If it's dark and if it's hot and you work out outside, you should wear lighter coloured clothing. Right? You want to reflect as much of the sun and the heat as you can. And if you've been ill, particularly if you've had a fever or you've had diarrhea, or if you've had a stomach bug, then you're going to be at pretty high risk for dehydration because you lost so much fluid while being ill. And of course, getting old. That always puts you at more risk, but that's part of the game. We don't want to not get old, right? So the choice is get old and we have to drink more. So, Wednesday, no class. Not good. It's not good. Please, it's not a day off school, okay? It is supposed to be an opportunity for you to go to the student research conference and support your peers who are presenting data that they may have collected, or for you to learn something new. So please think about attending the student research conference, at least for part of the day, even if you don't go to the whole day. All right, I will see you Friday. Put your